tonight I wanted to introduce you to a form of evidence for Vikings in the Viking Age that I think is not sufficiently well taken into account when people think about that period, namely that of runic inscriptions. People think Vikings are all about archaeology or possibly about the sagas, which were written many centuries later, or the sort of contemporary chronicles, monkish chronicles of the British Isles, which didn't like Vikings very much. But what we have in runic inscriptions is a whole set of texts which were written by people we might call Vikings themselves. So that gives us an insight. These texts tell us what they were called, who they were married to, what they thought, and all kinds of wonderful things. So that's what I want to introduce you to tonight. Now, I think everyone's probably heard of runes, but it's probably worth giving a little bit of background on what I mean by runic inscriptions. First of all, they cover both the Viking Age and what we Viking people call the medieval period, which is the period after the Viking Age. In Britain and Ireland, there are at the moment 149 known separate inscriptions. More than 90 of these contain personal names, often more than one. So that means that there are over 142 people mentioned in these inscriptions, and there certainly were many more, because as you'll see, many of the inscriptions are fragmentary. And every one of these persons has a story. The inscriptions don't always tell the full story, but that gives us a chance to speculate and to think about what their stories might have been. This is a map from a recent book by Michael Barnes showing the grey area shows the areas of the world in which runic inscriptions have been found. Now, that doesn't mean they're equally distributed in this area. In fact, the vast majority of surviving runic inscriptions are found in what is now modern Scandinavia. But runic inscriptions have been used by people speaking various forms of the Germanic family of languages right across these areas. Runes are an alphabet, no more, no less. And in the same way as our word alphabet comes from the Greek, from the first two letters of the Greek alphabet, namely alpha and beta, so the runic alphabet is known as Futhark, from the first six letters of that alphabet. And yes, I can count. TH here stands for one letter. So we can call them Futharks or rune rows. There are actually four different versions of the Futhark that we know of, not including the one invented by Professor Tolkien, about which I will say nothing. So the oldest inscriptions in this alphabet are what we call the older runes. This is an alphabet of 24 characters, so very similar to our alphabet. And the inscriptions here are found both in Scandinavia and the European continent in the period between about 150 and 700. All these dates are AD, by the way. Then there's a version of the alphabet that developed in Anglo-Saxon England and in Frisia, and this has more than 24 characters. There's some variation, and the period, these start with the coming of the Anglo-Saxons to England in the 5th century, and this alphabet is used regularly up until about the year 1000. And these are found, I have put England and Frisia there, but actually there are Anglo-Saxon inscriptions in Scotland, most famously the Ruthel Cross. But that's modern day Scotland. In those days that was part of Northumbria. The two alphabets I'm going to be talking about today are the Viking Age runes, firstly, which are found both in Scandinavia and in what I call the Viking world, which is places that Scandinavians went to. This alphabet is a reduced alphabet. It has only 16 characters. And then they realized eventually that they really needed a few more. I don't know if you could try and imagine writing English with only 16 letters. So they developed what we generally call the medieval runes. So this is what I mean by the medieval period succeeding the Viking Age, between about 1050 and 1450 runes continue to be used in Scandinavia and the Viking world. So again, parts of the world where the Scandinavians went. And just to show you what they look like, you've probably seen these shapes before, but I just wanted to remind people that there are these 4 different alphabets, because I find very, very often that people use the older runes even in a Viking context. So people use the wrong alphabet, and I'm on a mission really to try and get people to use the right runic alphabet. Many people, when they think of Viking Age runic inscriptions, think of the rune stones of the late Viking Age. Here is a typical one, which happens to be in Princes Street Gardens in Edinburgh. If you haven't seen it, go and have a look at it. Although I believe they're going to move it somewhere, I'm not quite sure where. This is originally from Sweden. It's probably from the 11th century. It ended up in Scotland in the 18th century. And it's actually a very typical example of the genre. You have a block of granite. It has a band around the edge with the runic inscription. That inscription is quite formulaic. There's a man called Ari who has raised the stone in memory of his deceased father, Hjalmur. We're in the late Viking Age, so the stone is very obviously Christian in 2 ways. There's a great big cross in the middle of it, and there's also a prayer at the end, may God help his spirit. And monuments of this type, there are over 3,000 of them, mainly in Sweden, but also in other parts of the Viking world. So it was a fashion of, at the very beginning of the introduction of Christianity to Scandinavia, people used their traditional form of writing, which is runes, which, as you saw, go back well before this period, to do a new thing, to put up memorials for their dead relatives. And we find this kind of monument over here as well, and more specifically in the Isle of Man. And the Isle of Man is an extraordinary runic landscape. It has over 30 Viking Age runic inscriptions, the vast majority of them memorial stones of this type. So it's not exactly the same type. It's interesting, this is earlier, this is 10th century rather than the 11th century, earlier than the Swedish example I've shown you, which raises some interesting questions which I won't go into. But you can see you have something very similar. You have a big block of stone, in this case the local stone. You have a big cross in the middle, and you have the formulaic expression, so-and-so, in this case a person called Sandulfur the Black, raised this cross in memory of Arinbjörg, his wife. But there are several interesting differences here. First of all, you'll notice that there are other images besides the cross. There's quite a lot of animals and things crawling up the sides of the monument. The inscription itself is slightly different in that it doesn't talk of raising a stone, but of raising a cross, which is a word, I will digress very briefly because I think it's so fascinating. The word cross originally starts as the Latin word crux, which is borrowed into Irish. In Irish, from Irish it's borrowed into Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, and from Old Norse it's borrowed into English. So the Vikings gave you the word cross, don't forget that. And as those of you who studied English may remember, the English called the cross a rood, as in the dream of the rood. The other interesting thing is here is a man commemorating his wife, and that's quite unusual in Scandinavia. It's not unknown, but it's actually proportionally much more common in the Isle of Man, interestingly enough. The other thing to notice is you can't in these pictures see the inscription because the inscription goes up the narrow sides of the stone. So there you, just one narrow side in fact. So there you have my photographs of the inscription as it goes up from bottom up along the narrow edge of the stone. This lady Arinbjörg, many people think that's her. If you look very carefully, it's a figure sitting on a horse with 2 feet on one side. So is that a lady riding side saddle? It could very well be, but we don't really know. But it's nice to think that might have been how her husband imagined his dead wife. There's lots of these in the Isle of Man, so I'm going to show you some of my favorites. Here's another one. The name in the pointy brackets just means that we're not exactly sure what the name is supposed to be. That's just how it's spelt in the inscription. But here's someone called Ualfir or something like that. We're given a bit more information about him now. He's the son of Thorulfur the Red, raised this cross in memory of his mother. So we've had a wife, now we have a mother, his mother Frida. And once again you have the cross, you have various other imagery, you have the inscription going up the narrow side, and here you have a little chap at the top who might be a portrait of Ualfir, I don't know, or possibly his father Thorulfur the Red, who knows, but he's a little warrior with a spear and a shield. I hope you can see that in the right hand picture. And these are substantial monuments. This one is substantially taller than I am. We've had a wife, we've had a mother, and we have a daughter as well. This is a slightly later monument, we think. It was also originally a cross. It's damaged. You can see the top is broken. Here's a chap called Hevin placed this cross in memory of his daughter Hlif Hildur. But you can just see the shaft of the cross going up the middle of the stone there. So here we have the inscription on the front of the stone, not going up the edge. And a nice little Viking ship. You can perhaps make it out there again. I don't know what that was meant to signify, but it's interesting to speculate. Here we also are told not only the person who commissioned the monument, but the person who actually carved the runes, who was a separate person. So what we have here is not people making their own monuments, but actually buying someone in to carve the runes, who may or may not have been the same person who did the other carvings on these stones. So you needed money to do this kind of thing. You needed to hire someone to carry the stone to its position. You needed someone to shape the stone, to carve the images. You needed someone to write the runes. And then someone called Sigurður got his name on here, and we don't know why. It was possibly later. This is one of the few inscriptions that seems to have been written on after the original inscription. Here you have the bit where it says that Arni carved the runes, most of it. It says Risti Runar Thessar, and underneath you can perhaps just make out another line of very faint runes. We think this is probably someone trying to copy that inscription, but not entirely succeeding. So someone perhaps who didn't know runes quite as well, didn't know how to use them. So again, an interesting question. Why would someone later on, and how much later on, 50 years, 100 years later, want to add some runes to this monument? The more you look at these things, the more you start wondering about these people and what they're actually doing. We've had 3 monuments so far. Every single person named in these 3 inscriptions from the Isle of Man that I've shown you so far has a Scandinavian name. The runes are Scandinavian runes of the Viking Age. The language is Old Norse. But what's interesting in the Isle of Man, as you might imagine, is that there is a lot of evidence of linguistic and cultural hybridity. And quite a number of the people mentioned in inscriptions have Celtic names. And here is a very good example, a very interesting inscription. Again, we have the usual formula. Malimkun, we don't know exactly what name that's supposed to be, but we do know it's a name of an Irish type with that first element mal, meaning servant of or follower of, or raised this cross in memory, again, another Irish name, Malmuri, something like that. His foster mother, who was the daughter of Dufgal, good Celtic name Dougal, the wife whom Athisel was married to. So we have 4 people mentioned here, 3 of whom have Celtic names, and only the husband of the dead woman has a Scandinavian name. Again, still the runes are Scandinavian, the language is Scandinavian. So you can ask yourself, did these people what kind of family was this? Were they just adopting the local names because they liked them, or were they actually local people who'd married into an incoming Scandinavian family? Were they bilingual? Were they speaking Old Norse? Were they speaking Celtic? We don't really know. There's some evidence. The reason there are several question marks in this inscription is it's grammatically not entirely correct. And a lot of people have thought maybe these people are actually mainly Celtic speakers who are trying to write Old Norse but are not very good at it because they haven't learned the grammar properly. So that's one very interesting aspect of the inscription. The other, but at the same time, they're Scandinavian enough to have absorbed a little bit of Scandinavian proverbial knowledge. So we have this proverb really at the end of the inscription saying it's better to leave a good foster son than a bad son. I think you could write a whole novel about this. You start with Dufgal, probably a sort of local chieftain on the Isle of Man. He gets married, has a daughter. His daughter catches the eye of a handsome Viking who's just arrived. They get married. They have a son who turns out to be no good and goes away. And in their sorrow, they adopt another young man. And when the mother dies, the original son is nowhere to be seen, so the foster son does the right thing by his mother and puts up this splendid memorial. You could easily turn that into a novel if you're so inclined. I think there's a market out there for it. Another inscription, again, similar, probably not the same Dufgal. It was quite a common name at the time, as it still is. Drujan, the son of Dufgal, raised this cross in memory of his wife Avmiul. Here, all three people mentioned have Celtic names. Here, there's nothing wrong with the grammar. It's perfect Old Norse, Scandinavian runes. So again, what kind of family is this? Why is this family, who are entirely named with Celtic names, choosing to use the Scandinavian language? Was it the elite language? Was it more fashionable to speak Scandinavian than to speak your original language? Or were they actually people of Scandinavian origin who simply adopted local naming customs? Either of those is a possibility. This is my favorite, I think, of all the inscriptions in the Isle of Man. Again, it hints at some really deep story that we just don't know. And I'm just going to turn this around because actually what you see here is the top of a cross. Unlike all the other ones where the top's been knocked off, here we have the top surviving, but not the rest. And what we are missing here, presumably, is yet again an inscription following that formula. X put up this cross in memory of Y. That is what all of these monuments say, but sometimes they give extra information, like the ones that told us who somebody's father was or so on, like the proverb about the foster son. Here, we're told of some kind of crime that happened. I think we have to assume, because it starts with but, that Hrossketil was probably the dead person being commemorated here. Hrossketil had some kind of sworn brother, a sworn confederate, someone he'd sworn oaths with. They'd probably gone out trading or raiding or whatever and promised to stick to each other thick and thin. And something happened. We have to assume probably that Hrossketil died as a result of whatever betrayal his sworn confederate carried out. Hrossketil perhaps never came home. His body is somewhere, who knows, on the Isle of Lewis or God knows what. And his family back home in the Isle of Man have put up a monument in his memory. And they've come right out and said, it's his friend what done it, in a state of truce. That's the worst thing you could do in Viking ideology, is betray someone to whom you'd sworn oaths. And I think it's quite a strong statement. These are public monuments. They were out in the landscape by crossroads or possibly near churches or meeting places. Anyone who could read the runes would know that Hrossketil is the criminal, the traitor. Presumably Hrossketil was also somewhere far away. I don't think he could have stayed on the Isle of Man with this being said in public about him. Right, you might be thinking, that's enough Isle of Man, so let's move on, this time to Ireland, and also to different kinds of inscriptions, not these stone monuments. This is a little piece of metal work, which we know, because the inscription tells us, must once have been attached to a sword. And so it's a kind of label, it's quite a fancy label. And it says, Domhnall Seal's head owns this sword. And again, it raises all kinds of questions. Well, the first thing is, the Vikings really liked their nicknames. We've already had Sandulf the Black and the other one, Thorulf the Red. Those are very common types of nicknames, possibly referring to people's hair color, we're not very sure. But they had many other kinds of nicknames, and clearly this guy looked, you can just see looking at that seal, you can just imagine what Domhnall looked like, a little bit bald, perhaps, big round eyes, a sort of round face. And so that was his name. He also has a Celtic name, again, but he's writing Scandinavian runes, he's writing grammatically correct Old Norse. And how many people had a sword is the other question. Did everyone have a little tag so that when the Vikings all went into the pub and they lined up their swords outside, they could find the right one on the way out? I don't know. This is the only such object we found so far. Or did he just like writing in runes? There's something about runes that causes people to want to write them. It's very strange. This is probably the strangest inscription to my mind. This is from Dublin. It is, as you can see, literally the antler of a deer. If you can see, kind of in the middle there's a bit scraped off, and that's where the runes are carved. And the runes are nice and clear, there's no problem reading them. What it all means is another question, but it seems to say that the deer's antler lay at the river mouth. Well, you know, there's the River Liffey in Dublin. It's near the mouth of the river, so somebody sitting there on the beach one day sees a piece of antler, picks it up, thinks, oh, this is a nice piece of antler. I'll write a little story about how I came across this antler. Well, there's nothing else to do. They didn't have Netflix or Twitter or anything else to keep them busy, so they wrote and probably this is more intelligent than some of the things you read on Twitter these days. And it's a little bit poetical, the idea, how did a deer's antler get into the river mouth? It's probably what the person who wrote this inscription was thinking. Before I go on, yes, more scratches on bits of metalwork. And now we've finally come to Scotland. Hunterston, I think I saw a sign for it coming here today, so close to here, and if you've been to Edinburgh at all, in the National Museum you'll have seen this object. Now normally art historians like to show the front of the object because it is really rather a splendid pin. Pin is perhaps a slightly understatement, I don't know, for this extremely complicated, beautiful, valuable object. And along comes someone and scrawls his name on the back in runes. Well, here we know from the type of object it is that it was an old object, so it wasn't new when Melbrigtha put his name on it, when Melbrigtha claimed ownership of this very splendid brooch. Now you think, okay, how did Melbrigtha get hold of this brooch? Is it Viking loot? Was Melbrigtha a Viking who stole this? Well, that might be, but the interesting thing is, once again, Melbrigtha is another one of these Celtic names with that mal element. So, are there other possible stories? Perhaps it wasn't stolen at all. Perhaps he bought it and he was so proud that he put his name on it. Or perhaps the brooch belonged to some local chieftain here in Strathclyde who gave it as a gift of friendship, and Melbrigtha and the Viking receiving it wanted to make clear that he'd actually received it from Melbrigtha, who was the rightful owner. Again, you can spin all kinds of stories around these simple statements because we don't really know what the original context was. From the sublime to the ridiculous, moving down to England, a comb case. There would have been a comb folding into this case, so that's been lost. Only the case survives. And here we have an inscription by the person who made the object. So somebody called Thorfaster, a good Scandinavian name, made a good comb. See, advertising, is it the first comb he ever made? He was so proud of it that he wrote this on the comb, or was he a regular comb maker who used runes as a form of advertising to encourage people to come back and buy more combs from him? Was he even working in Lincoln? As you know from just walking down the street, combs get lost all the time. This could have been someone bringing it over from somewhere in Norway or Denmark or Sweden. The Thorfaster, very common name across the Scandinavian world, so we can't say where he came from. But again, an interesting object in that way. And also shows that kind of ordinary people would know runes. There's no point in writing this little bit of advertising on this fairly simple everyday object unless you thought people could read it. Now this is where things get interesting. This is a fairly recent metal detectorist find from Lincolnshire, and it's one of our very few or practically unique runic inscriptions that actually give us some possible insight into the religious world of the pre-Christian Vikings, since it seems to mention Odin and Heimdallr, the watchman of the gods, and then a character called Thjalfa, who is a bit obscure, and then a person called Ulfljot. It seems to be inviting these possibly deities to help a person called Ulfljot. Now Ulfljot is, in this case, a male name. The object is a spindle whorl, so very much an object associated with women. Did a woman carve this for her husband or beloved, or the other way around? It's very, very mysterious, and we don't fully understand this one yet, particularly since these things can be hard to date, but this is not an early Viking Age object. It's probably from the 11th century or thereabouts, by which time we would expect the Vikings settled in Lincolnshire to have become Christian. So why would they be calling on Odin to help them out? A very interesting question. There is just a close-up of it, and I couldn't resist putting in a craftsman who does museum quality replicas of Viking objects called Adam Parsons has recently made one for us. We're having some Viking exhibitions in Nottingham later this year, and he's made, so that's an idea of what it might have looked like when it was new. It's made of lead. It's a spindle whorl. So when you're spinning, I don't know if any of the ladies dressed as Vikings can help out. It's called a drop spindle. You have a stick, and this is a weight on the bottom of it, and it makes it go around. So when you're spinning wool, so it's quite a small object, but very definitely associated with spinning. I said something a moment ago about runes kind of seeming to encourage people to write them all the time, and a lot of our runic inscriptions are graffiti. And again, moving a little bit up in time, because this is a runic graffiti on the wall of Carlisle Cathedral, so therefore it cannot be any older than Carlisle Cathedral, and probably is from the 12th century. And here we have somebody called Dolgfinn wrote these runes on this stone. Such a profound statement, but one that people liked writing. And they did seem to want to just put their mark on things. This one is a little bit interesting because the word used for writing, vreit, is really an English word in this context. It's not really an Old Norse word, but the rest of the inscription is Old Norse. So again, suggesting a bit of a hybrid culture. Or is this someone just passing through Carlisle in the 12th century, somebody possibly of Norwegian origin, or were people in Carlisle still speaking Old Norse in the 12th century? There is a bit of evidence that they were. And recently, or not that recently now, nearly 10 years ago, another inscription was found high up somewhere on one of the blocks of the cathedral with the name Ragnvaldur, just the name, nothing else. Right, speaking of graffiti, another one of my favorite runic sites on the mainland of Orkney, the prehistoric chambered cairn of Maeshowe, which was built around 3000 BC. It was closed at some point after it was built, and apparently, if we trust the archaeologists, it wasn't reopened again until the middle of the 12th century AD. There it is, in case you don't know where it is. And it's interesting for all kinds of reasons, not least it's the only inscription in the British Isles that uses the word Viking. But again, it poses an interesting question, because as you can see from this picture, the middle part of the inscription is broken away, so it's not entirely clear what it's saying, and it's ambiguous in the sense that the sentence might be about a Viking or a person called Vikingur, because we do know that Vikingur was used as a personal name in Scandinavia at the time. And we are in the 12th century, so normally we academics don't think of that anymore as the Viking Age, but they're still using the word Viking or the name Viking. They still have some connection with that Viking period, which is very interesting. That's the inside of the chambered cairn. And what happened was, you can see the entrance there, that would have been the original entrance. When people broke in the 12th century, they broke in through the top, but then they cleared out the entrance, and they used that entrance to go in and out, as I'll show you in a moment. And you can see up there on the right-hand side, number 1 is where that inscription is. So when it said coming in through that entranceway. Maeshowe consists of 33 separate inscriptions. They're all graffiti. 6 of them consist only of names. 11 consist of a name plus some kind of carver formula. So like, so-and-so carved these runes. And the rest contain various kinds of statements which seem to allude to stories of, which is the ones I'm going to focus on. And they seem to have been carved by a number of people, possibly on several occasions, but within a fairly short time period in the middle of the 12th century. And linguistically, it seems we can identify that the carvings were Norwegians, Icelanders, and Orcadians. So they're a mixed bunch of people, and there's probably a reason for that. Now, one of the things these graffiti carving people were obsessed with was wealth. Now, they'd broken into this mound. It wasn't the custom in 3000 BC to bury people with large amounts of wealth in such a mound, but in Scandinavia, at a later period, it was. So it may be that they broke in thinking, oh, if we break into that mound, we'll find silver and gold and, oh, that Tutankhamun and everything else. And they didn't, but they seem obsessed with this idea. So they kind of are carving these little stories explaining why they're not finding all the silver and gold that they were hoping to find. And here's a perfect example of fake news. You know, when someone says, I know it's true, you know it's probably going to be wrong. The wealth was brought away 3 nights before they broke this mound. So they're accusing someone of taking away the wealth that was supposed to be in the mound. Well, some people think it's concealed in the northwest. And then someone else comes along and says, oh, it's long ago, you know, it's long gone. And then they kind of, well, they are resigned that they're not going to find this wealth. Fortunate is he who can find the great riches. It's not going to be us, unfortunately. And that's what some of the graffiti look like. They're very well written runes. These are people who are extremely literate. They knew how to use runes. They knew how to write grammatically correctly. They knew how to write complete sentences. These are original sentences. They're not copying out of anything. This is a bunch of people who were runically very literate. Okay, so there's more stories. So suddenly we get an accusation, someone called Hakon, not our king Hakon Hakonsson that we're commemorating in this lecture, but a different Hakon carried the wealth out of this mound. But then Jerusalem men. Who are these Jerusalem men? Well, we can easily link these inscriptions, and we can't prove it, but it's, I think, about 99% certain that the people writing these inscriptions were the members of a crusade to the Holy Land that was led by Earl Rögnvalder of Orkney in 1152. And probably after they came back, for whatever reason, they sheltered in this mound and amused themselves by carving graffiti, but very literate graffiti on the walls. And indeed, they claim to have broken into the mound. So they're boasting of their achievements. Not only did they go all the way to Jerusalem, but they came back and they broke into the mound at Maeshowe. And the Earl's housekeeper, Cleef, a woman, carved these runes. So not only do we have highly literate male rune carvers, but we do actually have several female names in these graffiti, including the Earl's housekeeper. Which brings me to the interesting question of women in Maeshowe. So that's, again, what the inscriptions look like. You can't see it very well in these photographs, so I'll move on quickly. They're telling stories about wealth, but they're also being quite literary. Here's an inscription which, as you can see from the way I've laid it out, is actually in verse. So, Thessa runa reist sá maður runster fyrir vestan haf, með þeirri öxi átti Gaukur Trandilssonur fyrir sunnan land. This is really fake news. First of all, it's obvious that the runes are not carved with an axe. So that's a lie. Secondly, Gaukur Trandilsson is a very minor character known from some Icelandic sagas, but he lived in the 10th century, if he lived at all. So it's highly unlikely that someone in Orkney would have his axe. So again, they're alluding to well-known stories, to literature, but without necessarily telling the whole truth. Another literary reference, you may have all heard of Ragnar Lothbrok, especially if you've been watching a certain program on the History Channel. That is possibly who is being alluded to here. Here's someone saying this mound was constructed before Lothbrok's mound. But Ragnar Lothbrok is a man, but here Lothbrok is a woman because she had sons who were daring, who were men, the sort of people you would really call men. So possibly a different version of the story, or possibly a different character entirely, but with this name or nickname Lothbrok, which means shaggy breeches. Again, obviously there's some kind of heroic story lurking behind this graffiti, which I think all the people in the mound carving these inscriptions and in dialogue with each other, they would have known these stories. They didn't need to tell the whole story because the stories were in oral circulation, but they amused themselves by referring to them in their graffiti. So that's, you can see just the layout of the ones I've just been showing you. So there's really three kinds of stories in Maeshowe. All of these are, I would say, fiction, or maybe not. There's the stories of hidden wealth, there's the stories about the Jerusalem farers and what they got up to, and there's stories about characters known from other stories in Old Norse literature. But there's also stories from real life, I think, and here's one. Ingibjörg, a fair widow. Many a woman has travelled stooping in here. A great show-off. Erlinger. Very obscure. Presumably Erlinger is the one who wrote this, but we're not very sure. Who's the great show-off? Is that Erlinger or Ingibjörg the Fair Widow? And who are all these women who've travelled stooping in here, and why? That's what the inscription looks like. You can see, perhaps make out, that it also uses some special kind of runes, which are cryptid runes. The bottom line there of the 3 lines of runes has a different kind of runes. So again, they're showing off. So maybe that's the showing off. That's actually Erlinger's name in these special runes. He's showing off that he knows different ways of writing runes, including cryptic forms. As far as stooping, and I can assure you, and probably some of you have been there as well, you do need to stoop to get in, because the entrance passage varies between 0.7 and 1.4 meters high, so no adult can actually stand up. And it's quite a long entrance passage, so you're kind of stooping all the way in. So what did these ladies come there for? Is there anyone in the audience who is under 18? Oh, thank God for that. But if you are of a delicate sensibility, you might like to look away now. Thorny is a woman's name. Helgi is a man's name. They said it like it is. And Helgi's obviously very proud of... but what I find actually particularly interesting about this inscription is where it is. That's what it looks like, or part of it. It's number 10, so you can see number 10 is inside that little cubby hole there. And I haven't actually crawled in myself, but I've looked in and I've decided that you can just about get 2 people in there. So maybe that's where it happened, who knows. Moving on. My very last example brings us very close to home. It seems very appropriate to end with this one. It's still graffiti. They're still just kind of scratching their names on everything. This is a cave on Holy Island off Arran, which contains lots, and I've never been there, it's quite difficult to get there, contains lots and lots of carvings from many different periods of time, and it may be that there are other runic carvings hidden in amongst all the other graffiti that people haven't found yet, but these are the ones that people have found so far. And again, they're the usual graffiti. 4 of them are just personal names. There's Svein, there's Almundur, there's Johan, which is not Joan, I'm afraid, but John or Johan, and Olafur. All common names, although obviously Johan is a name that comes only in the Christian period, and Olafur is a very common name of real people, but it might also be, because this is the site of a hermitage, it's a place of pilgrimage, it might also be someone expressing his dedication to the saint, Saint Olaf of Norway. But 2 of the inscriptions tell us a bit more. One that was carved by a person called Nikolaus from Hein, which is probably a place in Norway. There are several candidate places. So we don't know much about that, but it links certainly these inscriptions to Norway. And then there's a person called Vigleikr Stallari, the King's Marshal, carved. And most people are inclined to associate these carvings with the Battle of Largs in 1263, because it actually says in the saga of Hakon Hakonsson that he lay off Arran and Holy Island for a while before coming to Largs, and he also had a person called Vigleikr with him. The Vigleikr in the saga isn't identified as the King's Marshal, but it is a relatively unusual name, and I think the fit is pretty good. And I think, therefore, we can't prove it. The other names are all fairly common. Vigleikr is not. I think it's quite likely that these inscriptions were carved probably before the Battle of Largs, but in that year, 1263, not so very far from here. So these are the people then, who knows? We do know that Vigleikr survived the battle. We don't know what happened to the rest. I've kind of tried to look and see whether these other names occur in the saga. Well, there's many Johans and Olafs and not so many of the other names, so it's not really possible to identify all these people, but I think the connection is very plausible. So leaving us in 1263 and towards the end really of the Norse period, at least in this particular part of the world, I'll just conclude by saying I hope you've enjoyed meeting a few of these Vikings and their descendants through their runic inscriptions. That's where I got my pictures from. And I hope I've examined the runes and interpreted them correctly. Thank you very much.
Lord Glasgow is going to offer a vote of thanks.
The texts are in language,
Yes.
but they're made up of individual
Yes.
characters which are from an alphabet, and that alphabet was developed in the Germanic-speaking world. So
Yes.
the sounds of that alphabet reflect the sounds of those languages. If anything, the runes are probably modelled on the Roman alphabet, so you may have noticed some of the letters are quite similar,
Oh, I see.
like B or R or T.
Yes. Anyway, I think I'm speaking for all of us here to say that really was a tremendously good lecture, really interesting. And it's my pleasure to thank Judith very much indeed on behalf of the Viking Festival and of the Largs Historical Society for such an absolutely terrifically interesting talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.